As we think about Holy Week, which we're entering into now, a lot of times we think about Palm Sunday and we think about Easter Sunday, and everything in between gets a little bit fuzzy, and we lose track of some of the details of what happened in the biblical storyline. We decided to ask a number of New Testament scholars if they would help us out, provide some of the historical, cultural, theological background, the sort of things that we might miss as we're reading through the story. We want to take each day of the week and try to answer some of those questions. So let's start with Sunday, Palm Sunday, March 29th, the first day of the week, first day of the Jewish week, and really the last week of Jesus' earthly life. We call it Palm Sunday because a crowd of Jesus' disciples, his followers, along with these Galilean pilgrims in town for the Passover festivities, had spread their palm branches and their cloaks on the ground as Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Now, most of us know at least that much of the story, but the details, the setting, the background, how many people actually populated Jerusalem at that time? How big was it? How many people were in town visiting for the festival? And what were they expecting from the coming Messiah? And what made this situation in particular, Jesus' actions, so volatile for the Jewish and the Roman leaders?
Jerusalem was a very exciting place about this time of the year. Passover is one of the great pilgrimage festivals for the Jewish people, and so a city that people estimate might have been around 40,000 would sometimes get to be 6 times that size at that time of the year as Jews flocked in from everywhere. It was a very exciting place, a busy place, a crowded place, and a place that the Romans really worried about during that week, because all of these Jews were gathering together. They were excited about their religion, and the Romans wanted to keep control of that, and so they were extra watchful of the Jews during that time.
The way Jesus entered the city, mounted on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecy in Zechariah that the Messianic king would enter the city of Jerusalem exactly in this way, was very significant. It also emulated the way King Solomon entered the city when he was declared king. So the message, visually and spiritually was unmistakable that here the Messianic king came to enter God's holy city, Jerusalem. The crowds responded with excitement because many of them had heard about the Messiah and were expecting a national deliverer to reestablish the Davidic kingdom. And so Jesus, as one who taught with authority, far exceeding their other religious teachers, as one who healed, who even raised the dead, very much looked like the part of the Messiah. And so they welcomed him and prepared the way for him as the Davidic king entering the holy city of Jerusalem.
Jesus was entering into a very volatile situation then, and we could well understand how his entry into the city and some of the things that happened that week would have created a lot of concern for both Jews and Romans. Romans who wanted to keep the lid on things, but the Jewish authorities who wanted to keep a good reputation with Rome as well. They didn't want to let things get out of hand either because they wanted to keep good relationships with Rome. And so it was a very pressurized situation for Jesus and his disciples during that week of what was called the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, culminating in Passover.
We now come to the second day of Holy Week. It's Monday, March 30th, AD 33. Jesus and his disciples, they spent the night in Bethany, and they decided to make their journey westward back into the city of Jerusalem. And here we see Jesus engage in two of his most unusual and startling activities. First of all, as they're walking towards Jerusalem, he sees a fig tree, it won't provide him breakfast, and he instantly calls down a curse upon that tree. And then when he actually makes his way to the Temple Mount, he begins overturning the tables, driving out the money changers, sending the pilgrims scattering away. What's going on here? Well, why would Jesus curse an innocent tree just because it wouldn't provide him with food? And what can we learn about the place of the temple in Jewish life, and about the way in which Jesus taught his disciples? And how does all of this fit into the final storyline of Jesus' march toward Calvary?
For many readers of the New Testament, Jesus cursing on the fig tree is one of the oddest things they will ever read. I think the answer is actually provided in the text of Scripture itself. First of all, when we go to the Gospel of Mark, we see a literary technique that most scholars call a Markan sandwich. What a Markan sandwich is that we have one thing going on here, something else, and then a third piece that's very similar to this piece. So two pieces of bread with the meat in the middle. What we learn about this literary technique as it's deployed over and over again in the Gospel of Mark is that the two pieces of bread are related to the meat in the sandwich, and they mutually interpret each other. So we know that the curse on the fig tree must have something to do with the cleansing of the temple. The other thing we learn from Scripture is that, especially in the Old Testament, is that the fig tree is closely associated with Israel. This all comes together then when we see Jesus goes in the temple, cleanses it as an act of judgment against Israel. Just earlier, he had cursed the fig tree. What's happening is in cursing the fig tree, he is parabolically judging Israel, saying, "You haven't borne fruit unto Yahweh, and as a result, you are cursed."
The temple was not just the heart of Judaism, it wasn't just central religion. The temple was the actual presence, the physical, living presence of God in His glory among His people. Therefore, Jesus teaching in the temple every time He went, and especially in pilgrimage times when the Jewish people were coming from Rome and from Babylon and from Alexandria and from all over the world, then Christ was bringing the Jewish people home to hear the voice of God in His house. When Jesus spoke elsewhere, it was synagogal. That the synagogues were originally developed to be a presence of the temple. This was especially during the exile, and the temple had been destroyed. Then they were the temple in all parts of the Jewish world. When rabbis went to a synagogue, they were very often asked to speak. There was a much more informal air than what we have today, where we have pastors who are always speaking every Sunday. But it was the common word for the official teachers of Judaism. And so Christ was already viewed as a teacher / rabbi, but at the same time, the leaders totally opposed him because what he was teaching was so much in conflict with what they were teaching. So he was accepted as a teacher and rabbi by the people, but rejected by the leaders.
We now come to Tuesday, March 31st, AD 33. You'll remember on Palm Sunday, Jesus had made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And then on Monday, he'd made quite the scene, declaring the temple to be not a house of prayer, as it was intended, but rather a den of thieves. All of this combined to put Jesus on an inevitable collision course with the Jewish authorities, and he spends all of Tuesday interacting with them, meeting their objections, raising questions of his own. But what exactly made the Jewish leaders so mad? What exactly were their objections against Jesus? Why precisely was he viewed as such a threat? And at this point in time, before Calvary, what were their options and what was their strategy?
At every moment during Passion Week, the leaders were watching Jesus, but they were watching him in order to show him to be wrong. To the Pharisees, Jesus was still the kid from Nazareth, who was to them still a young man. And here was this young man making these absolute claims, and he had never been trained. So Jesus was an uneducated Jewish upstart kid who threatened everything that they knew.
When Jesus engineered the house cleaning of the temple, the decommercialization of the temple on Monday, this, of course, was hailed by his Passover pilgrim followers and others. They thought it was great that he had broken the monopoly, at least for one morning or afternoon. Now, this, therefore, put the authorities in something of a panic. Now they somehow have to drive a wedge between Jesus and his followers because they really want to get rid of this troublemaker, now also for economic reasons. So they're trying to get Jesus to misspeak himself. And the questions are baited. They can't be answered, really. They're just like the old, can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it himself? See, they're unanswerable, self-defeating questions. And yet, it turns out that Jesus answers everyone correctly.
The Jews had some sort of a semi-autonomous status with regard to their internal political and religious affairs. And so as long as things were calm and peaceful, the Romans allowed the Jews a certain amount of autonomy. But at the same point, the Jewish leaders are beginning to feel that there's something that ought to be done in order for things not to spin out of control with regard to the Roman overlords.
Their entire goal was to find a way to arrest Jesus by stealth. That's why they then had to turn to Judas.
We now come to Wednesday, April 1st, AD 33, on this journey through the last week of Jesus' life. As Jesus is teaching his disciples, going about his business, another story is taking place inside the walls of Jerusalem. The members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious body, are having their own intense internal deliberations about how to get rid of him once and for all. Now, it's easy to read this very simplistically and to forget that these are real, living human beings, not just these two-dimensional characters. So our understanding of the storyline of this final week will grow as we begin to explore who these Jewish leaders were, what they were seeking to accomplish, what their motivations were, and why they found Jesus Christ to be so threatening and so frustrating to their religion and to their way of life.
It seems that many of Jesus' opponents were in the Sanhedrin, or the Sanhedrin. This is a council of the Jews, the ruling council, you might say. There were 71 members. This idea of the 70 probably began even with Moses in the Old Testament, where he was appointing 70 sub-elders to kind of organize the government for the Israelites as they're wandering through the desert. And this number 70 is always stuck, so that the leading council of the Jews, perhaps very aristocratically composed, was the Sanhedrin. It had both Pharisees and Sadducees inside it. And the leader, of course, is the high priest himself. In Jesus' case, it would be Joseph Caiaphas. Often the Sanhedrin would meet about once a month in Jerusalem, and of course there were special high holy reasons for them to come together, especially during the Passover festival. Whenever voting took place in some major issue in the Sanhedrin, it's very interesting, they always let the youngest member vote first, so that he is not simply overawed by the elders. And then the final decision is made, of course, by the older and more mature people, and the high priest last of all. During Holy Week, it is the Sanhedrin that is in charge, making plans as to what to do about this so-called messianic troublemaker.
We have to understand that the anger of the Jewish leaders was not restricted to Passion Week. The anger of the Jewish leaders began from the very start of Jesus' ministry. In actuality, they were plotting to kill him in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, right from the beginning. The Pharisees were those who had developed what we call the oral Torah, the oral tradition. And they believed the Torah went back to Moses. That is not just the written Torah and the Pentateuch, but the oral Torah, the traditions that they had developed over the last 100 years to tell the Jewish people how to live in accordance with the law. Jesus then challenged their very authority and challenged all of their teaching. By the time Christ came that final time to Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders had been opposing him for over 2 years because they believed that as long as there was blasphemy in the land, the true Messiah could not come. Jesus declared himself not just to be Messiah, but Son of God. And so each step it became more intense. And by the time they were getting close to Passover, they felt that if they did not arrest Jesus and have him killed, that indeed a messianic riot would take place and the Romans would destroy the nation.
We now come to April 2nd, AD 33. It's Thursday, which some churches refer to as Maundy Thursday. It's Passover week, so Jesus instructs his disciples to secure a paschal lamb and to go and get an upper room in the city of Jerusalem so that they can celebrate their own Passover supper together. Later that evening, Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and so begin the Jewish trials of Jesus. So as we explore this day, we can ask a few questions. Was it significant that Jesus' last week took place during Passover week? What is the relationship between the Last Supper and the Passover meal? And why couldn't the Jewish leaders have simply handled all of this on their own? Why did they need to go and get the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, involved?
The celebration of Passover was one of the great moments of the Jewish religious year. Of course, they were celebrating their deliverance from Egypt when God brought them out of their slavery, kind of created them as a people, and started them on the road to their own land. It was important to be in Jerusalem because only in Jerusalem in the temple could you actually have the Passover lambs slain. That were, of course, the centerpiece of the Jewish family meals. So those lambs were slain on the day before the Passover and then eaten that evening, just as perhaps Jesus and the disciples celebrated their own Passover meal as kind of a family of people together on that Thursday night as well.
Passover was a celebration in anticipation of Yahweh's rescue of his people, his redemption from the hand of Pharaoh. Typically, Jews ate at a table to eat, but not the Passover, not most festive meals. They would recline on the floor with pillows. Why? Well, during the Exodus, when they came out of Egypt, they didn't have tables to sit at. They lay down on the desert floor and ate. Lying down while eating became an expression of your freedom. So when the disciples take the Passover with Jesus, they're lying down, looking forward to that day when Yahweh would finally grant freedom to his people. So it's looking back to the Exodus in the past, but looking ahead to the Exodus to come. Now Jesus is saying, this is a new covenant, a new way that God's going to relate to his people through my death.
When Jesus was arrested late on that Thursday night, a series of what I guess I would call judicial proceedings unfolded. During the nighttime, there was a gathering of the Sanhedrin, the high Jewish authority, where all of the Jewish officials were together, kind of interviewing Jesus perhaps with a view to formulating an official charge. What can we charge this guy with that's going to stick? What's going to work? This might have been an unofficial proceeding because at nighttime, usually the Jews were forbidden from holding official trials. And it is, of course, in that context, you might remember in Mark 14 and parallels that they decide, oh, Jesus has committed a blasphemy. And so that gave them their sort of official basis to go ahead.
However, it turns out that 3 years before Good Friday, the first Good Friday, Pontius Pilate removed from them the jus gladii, the right of execution, on orders from an anti-Semitic patron of his in Rome. And for this reason now, Pilate and the Romans alone had the right of capital punishment. Previously, of course, the Sanhedrin would not even have taken Jesus' case to Pilate, but now he had to hear it.
So now we come to Friday, April 3rd, AD 33. The trials of Jesus, begun in the early morning hours, begin with the Jews, and they involve a brief appearance from Herod Antipas. But ultimately, the decision under God must rest with the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. A crucifixion, of course, was not a punishment invented only for Jesus, so it'll be helpful for us to learn a little bit of the history behind this barbaric form of torture in Roman times. If the disciples then could have heard that we now refer to this as Good Friday, they undoubtedly would have been perplexed, perhaps even offended, due to the suffering, shame, and humiliation that Christ endured. But while it's easy for us to focus only upon Christ's sufferings, for those of us with eyes to see, there's also glory to be found in this most important of days in salvation history.
Well, now we're up to the first Good Friday, and actually the action begins just before dawn when the Sanhedrin has to convene one last time in order to endorse what they had decided the night before, that Jesus should die. Because according to Jewish law, you cannot sentence a man to death in a night session. So this is why Luke carefully tells us that the Sanhedrin met on Friday morning, and they simply endorsed what they had done the night before at the Caiaphas hearing, and that is Jesus must die. They learned the process of crucifixion from, indeed, the Persians. They crucified some of their admirals after they lost the first naval battle to the Romans in the First Punic War in the 3rd century BC. And then used it in Rome only for extreme criminals. Those who were not Roman citizens could be crucified for serious crime. The whole idea is, look what this poor miscreant is suffering. Don't do what he did, or you're going to get hung up on the cross the same way. And therefore, it is a way of preventing further crime, they thought, in addition to giving the miscreant a very horrible way to die.
When we look at the way the Gospels, the different Gospels, present Jesus' suffering at the cross, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tend to focus more on the humiliation that Jesus endured and on the physical pain that he endured. While John, probably writing last, presents the cross more as a station back to the glory that Jesus had before the world began. It's not so much that he minimizes the physical suffering that Jesus endured, but he shows that this spiritual reality of glory being brought to the Father even at the cross overrides any physical suffering that he may have had to endure. And of course, the writer to the Hebrews as well says that Jesus endured the cross for the joy set before him. So you see in the biblical material this emphasis that the suffering was a necessary pathway to eternal glory.
We now come to April 4th, AD 33. It's a Saturday, and it's really a day of silence. The Bible simply doesn't give us much information about what happened on this day. The disciples are laying low, perhaps fearful that they might meet the same end as Jesus. And Jesus' body lay in the tomb, wrapped in a shroud, linen cloth. But how did Jesus, who normally would have been buried in a simple, shallow grave in the ground because he was a poor man, how did he end up in the rich family tomb of Joseph of Arimathea? And where was his spirit? We know where his corpse was, but where was the soul of Jesus Christ? How should we think about this quiet day, this day of waiting after Good Friday in anticipation of Easter Sunday?
Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and requests that he be allowed to take Jesus' body to give him a proper burial. In this he complied with the stipulation in the Hebrew Scriptures in the book of Deuteronomy that a person who's crucified must be buried on the same day. The rabbinic law also stipulated that a convicted criminal must be buried separately from others. And so the Gospels tell us that Joseph had this family tomb, a new tomb that had not yet held any corpses. We're told that he took a linen cloth and wrapped Jesus' body in it, and then put it in this freshly cut tomb. What we know about tombs in first century Palestine, especially in Jerusalem and the vicinity, is that they were often cut into the rock like caves into a slope, which would have been fairly labor intensive and expensive, and so for the most part limited to wealthy families. Yet another fulfillment of Scripture, since Isaiah said that Jesus, the Messiah's grave would be with the wealthy.
Where Jesus was during the Saturday between his death and his resurrection on the Sunday is not an easy question to answer. I think at the end of the day, the Bible's not altogether clear about that. A lot of people turn to the 1 Peter 3 passage where Peter talks about Christ in spirit going and preaching to spirits who are in prison. And traditionally, a lot of people have thought, well, that refers to Jesus between his death and resurrection, going to Hades, proclaiming the victory he had won, even perhaps proclaiming the gospel to people who had died so they would have a chance to respond to the grace of God in Christ. My own view, and it's a complicated and controversial issue, is that 1 Peter 3 is rather talking about Jesus at his ascension, proclaiming his victory over evil spiritual beings. I think that's probably the direction most contemporary scholars are going in interpreting the text. If that's true, then we really don't have any New Testament evidence that Jesus went to Hades or went to hell between his death and resurrection. And perhaps our best guess is that Jesus was in the presence of the Father on the Saturday. He tells the thief on the cross that he would be together with him in paradise that day. And our best guess, and it's not much more than that then, is that Jesus was indeed in the presence of the Father before, of course, his body was raised on Easter Sunday morning.
April 5th, AD 33. Finally, we arrive at Easter Sunday. Jesus gloriously, triumphantly rises from the dead, not only on the first day of the week, but really on the first day of the new creation. As we read the gospel accounts, we see that it's the women, the followers of Jesus, who discover the empty tomb, then run to tell the rest of the disciples. But what is the significance of this? That it was women who were the first to discover the tomb and to be the eyewitnesses of the resurrection. So as this week draws to a close, it's worth stepping back and asking, what can we learn about God's sovereign and eternal plan as we watch Him orchestrating not only this week, but really all of eternity for our good and for His glory?
The women who observed the location of the tomb, according to the Gospels, planned to return to the tomb on the Sunday to finish the preparation of Jesus' body.
This is interesting historically because the testimony of women at that time was not considered very dependable. It was not usually considered a firm basis for a legal charge, for instance, at that time. So the fact that our Gospels are unanimous in including the women as primary witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests the historicity of that particular moment. If the Gospel writers had wanted to commend Jesus' resurrection after the fact, they would have made some Roman officials, perhaps, the ones who discovered the empty tomb, or they would have had at least the male disciples be the ones who were the witnesses. The fact, again, that our Gospels talk about the women as the witnesses is just one of those many little items that suggests what we have in our Gospels is not something fabricated after the fact to explain the empty tomb. It's actually the way things happened on that original Easter morning.
Many liberal scholars have actually argued that Jesus was just a Jewish prophet, an apocalyptic prophet who was deluded about his own greatness and who was ambushed by one of his followers, Judas, and then ended up crucified. It's probably nowhere clearer than in the Gospel of John, who goes to great lengths to show that everything that happened to Jesus, especially in the final week, happened both according to God's predestined, foreknown plan, and also with the full knowledge of and anticipation of Jesus himself. So I think that's very, very important even for our salvation, ultimately. He was buried and then rose for us according to the Scriptures. It's the culmination point of God's history with His people, and it's also the heart of the gospel. The Gospels show that the crucifixion and the resurrection were very much not plan B, but God's way of providing redemption for humanity.